There is a lot of buzz around Canada's defense budget these days, as our nation's lack of military spending drew the personal ire of US President Donald Trump when he launched his tariff war. Since the 2014 NATO summit, successive Canadian governments, both Harper's Conservatives and the Trudeau Liberals, have pledged to move towards the Alliance's stated objective of spending 2% of gross domestic product, or GDP, on national defense. It is time to target just how serious Canada has been regarding our commitment to the NATO Alliance's spending objective. Under the Harper Conservatives, defense spending actually dipped below 1% of GDP, and while the Trudeau Liberals did boost investment in the military, Canada's defense budget was just 1.3% of GDP in January of this year. In response to Trump's threats and in an effort to appease the US President, newly elected Prime Minister Mark Carney announced on June 9th that Canada was going to meet the NATO spending objective of 2% GDP within the current fiscal year.
And so for all those reasons, I'm announcing today that Canada will achieve NATO's 2% of GDP target this year, half a decade ahead of schedule.
Close followers of the Canadian Armed Forces were astounded to hear that Canada would balloon annual defense spending from the current $40 billion to a whopping $62.7 billion, all before March 31st, 2026. Carney noted that while his budget included $9.3 billion in new money, the increase was to include some administrative restructuring and clever accounting to boost the stats. One of those moves was to bring the Canadian Coast Guard from Fisheries and Oceans to be in the National Defense umbrella. In my opinion, this was a long overdue no-brainer decision, as many other maritime nations, including the US, consider their Coast Guard as a fourth branch of the military. I still think Carney can go one step further by repositioning the RCMP as a federal police force similar to the French gendarme or the Italian carabinieri, both of which fall under the National Defense Ledger on their respective books. If Canada were to include the long-term care and benefits for our veterans through Veterans Affairs Canada, we could easily soar past the 2% GDP guideline without adding a tank or a bullet to our military. However, even Carney's sudden change of heart and infusion of cash into defense before we could even get to 2% of GDP, the spending bar was raised again. At the most recent ministers' meeting in Brussels, the NATO Secretary General announced that the alliance will raise the spending objective to 5% by 2032 or 2035. Either way, given Canada's current GDP, that will mean a defense budget over $150 billion. This may be music to defense company executives and the Colonel Blimps who tub thump in blind support of all things military. However, we need to focus more on what defense capability we are getting for all that money. In particular, we need to study what particular weapon platforms we are acquiring, as that will define our military role for the foreseeable future. At the height of the war in Afghanistan, the Canadian military made a convincing argument that our troops needed a heavy-lift helicopter capability. The roads were the battlefield of choice, and the leading cause of casualties among the Canadian contingent was improvised explosive devices. These were planted roadside. To solve the shortcoming, Canada spent $300 million to purchase 6 old Chinook D model helicopters from the United States Air Force. The Chinooks were already in theater, so the acquisition was made very quickly. With the RCAF now back in the heavy lift helicopter business, the Department of National Defense launched a lengthy procurement process to purchase 15 spanking new CH-147F Chinook models. These were delivered after Canada had concluded the mission in Afghanistan and all of our soldiers were safely home. 2 of the 6 Chinooks used in Afghanistan were damaged beyond repair, and the remaining 4 were scrapped due to their advanced age. Those familiar with the heliborne combat operations know that heavy-lift helicopters are vulnerable to ground fire, and as a result, they operate with ground attack helicopters as escorts. Canada does not have ground attack helicopters like the US Apaches, so in Afghanistan, the RCF may do with some upgunned CH-146 Griffin utility helicopters. These helicopters were woefully unsuited to the task, but as a hockey coach would say, you play the team on your bench. With the 14 remaining CH-147F Chinooks in the RCF service at present at CFB Petawawa, one was lost in a tragic training accident, Canada possesses a considerable aviation asset. This is a lot of capability to wage a counterinsurgency against a poorly equipped foe like the Afghan insurgents. However, Canada, NATO, and the US were taught a valuable lesson with the loss to the Taliban in Afghanistan. All the technology and weaponry in the world is useless against suicidal resistance. Therefore, it is unlikely that anyone in the West will embark on the fool's errand of trying to wage a counterinsurgency in a hostile state within the next generation. For the record, The CH-147F Chinooks are extremely expensive to operate, which explains why they are not more widely used in the fight against wildfires. For those watching the war between Russia and Ukraine, it would be obvious that heavy-lift helicopters would be flying death traps near the front lines in a near-peer conflict wherein the enemy has sophisticated air defense weapons. Thus, the RCF is well stocked, albeit still without ground attack helicopters for escort, to fight in Afghanistan again. However, if we truly wish to provide a deterrent to Russian aggression, we need to learn from the ongoing war in Europe. Our troops need low-level air defense, boatloads of first-person view FPV drones, drone countermeasures, self-propelled armored artillery, and heaps of ammunition. The problem is that every other NATO country has the same needs, and the armed forces of Ukraine remain at the front of the receiving line for obvious reasons. Let's hope that Carney's boost to defense is not a hollow promise that comes up a day late and a buck short. Our troops deserve better. This has been On Target. I'm Scott Taylor.